Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sharon Jacob. I am currently the professor of New Testament and Postcolonial Studies at Claremont School of Theology. And yay, represent people. And I'm really, really excited to be here and bring to you a little bit of my work on postcolonial studies and particularly applying that lens to the text on new wine and new wineskins. This presentation is actually an invitation. It's an invitation to engage in the way we explore this text through a postcolonial lens. I'm inviting us to deconstruct the ways in which we understand terminologies like old and new. These terms are used often to subtly perpetuate hierarchical structures within our understanding. So how could something like postcolonial theory help us to deconstruct these terms? We know the colonial legacy that has cast a shadow over the word church. Hey, Jim, welcome. That's okay. And the historical narrative of church has disregarded indigenous cultures as antiquated, inferior, and churches have gone around the world purportedly spreading this new religion. This dichotomy between old and new perpetuates a false sense of superiority and cultural erasure. When we view this parable through a decolonial lens, we can begin to embark on a journey of deconstruction. How do we challenge entrenched binaries of old versus new? How do we recognize the richness and relevance of traditional wisdom that can help shape contemporary thought and action? Our approach this afternoon will be a prompting to help evaluate our assumptions and biases and foster a more inclusive and holistic understanding of church and community. As we delve deeply into this discourse, let us start reflecting on our own narratives, our own stories, our own traditions and rituals. What untapped reservoirs of wisdom lie within our own cultural heritages? And how can we leverage these resources to reimagine the church in ways that are authentic and responsive to the diverse needs of our time? So let us embrace the power of collective introspection and reimagine the church anew, drawing inspiration from the past to chart a more equitable and inclusive future in the new world. Okay, so let's set, can you tell I'm a New Testament person? Because I'm going to set the context. It's very hard to take the Bible nerd out of me. Let's set the context of this pericope. Mark chapter 2, verses 18 through 22 is actually a part of the entire chapter 2, which runs from 1 to 27. And the overall context of this passage is the questioning of the authority of Jesus and the conflict between the law and the kingdom of God. So basically, here is an overview of the conflicts. Jesus has healed and forgiven the sins of a paralyzed man. He is eating with tax collectors. He is not fasting. Rudolf Bultmann describes these genre of these stories as controversial dialogue. A controversial dialogue begins with an action or an attitude that is challenged by the other party, and the responses are either a counter question, a metaphor, or both. Next slide. Let's start with the personal, and I apologize for the terrible translations, but this is how I could do the synoptics side by side. As you can see, this parable appears in both Matthew and Luke, and we also see a version of this parable in the Gospel of Thomas. Exegetes tend to agree that the language about the cloth and the wineskin existed independently in the pre-Markan tradition. Some scholars go so far to even argue that these could have been the actual words of Jesus. Most parables of Jesus, as you will see, draw on common experiences. They talk about weddings, farming, mending clothes, etc. Change is contextual, and our approach to change begins from what we already know, our personal. So instead of thinking about change as something that happens to us from the outside, that we're forced to reach or respond to, could we think about change as internal, a movement that is inevitable, already occurring, and progressing within us as we speak? The parable found in Mark is interesting because here Jesus talks about a gradual progression. Francis Maloney writes, the image of the unshrunk cloth being used to patch an old garment focuses upon the subsequent damage done to the old garment if the newer cloth is sewn to it. The patch tears away and the garment is left in an even more damaged state. It is the partially, surely, destruction of the older garment that is the point. Now, with the image of the new wine, however, the focus is upon the need to preserve the new wine. Such new wine poured into a less pliant old wineskins will destroy the wineskin and the wine. Could this parable be about change, but of change of both the old and the new? Next slide. Mary Louise Pratt talks about cultural intersections as a contact zone. And this is where postcolonial theory is really helpful. The contact zone is a social space where cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in context of highly asymmetrical relations of power, such as colonialism, slavery, or their aftermaths, as they're lived out in many parts of the world today. The relationship between the colonizer and the colonized were often viewed through a unidirectional lens, with power flowing from the colonizer to the colonized. However, as post-colonial scholars have shown us that these contact zones are contested sites. And when the colonizer and the colonized person meet in these contact zones, they are both changed. That change is inevitable. They push, resist, and are impacted by one another. So let me give you an example. This is not a rhetorical question. Where do you think you get really good Indian food? Okay, India, Indian restaurants. Where else? Yes, sir, you were saying. Fremont, okay. Think global. Think global. Where else do you think you get good Indian food? Yes, why? Yeah, right? Colonialism. England, you get really good food, Indian food. Why is that? It's because when Britain came to India and colonized India, they were impacted by some of the spices and some of the tastes of India, right? In the same way, in India, for example, we have a huge tea that we do in the afternoons. And you have sandwiches and snacks, and so we have all of that going on in India as well. In addition to that, if you read some of the works written by Indian authors, notice how they spell words, right? They follow a very British way of spelling words. So think about how in this highly contested space, both the colonizer and the colonized have found ways unconsciously to be changed by the other. Let's connect this back to the text. The new wine ferments, it expands, and the old wineskin is unable to contain the new wineskin and it bursts. From a post-colonial perspective, both the new wine and the wineskin, when they meet in the contact zone, the bag, they change. They change each other, and yes, the change is uncomfortable as they come in contact with one another. But that change is inevitable. Thus, to think that only the old changes when it when it comes in contact with the new and not vice versa, is a very limited way of understanding this text. Next slide, sir. Mixing the old and the new, is that a problem? A surface reading of this parable would suggest that the old and the new cannot mix. That when these two come in contact, there is a rupture, a bursting that is bound to happen, and the rupture is a bad thing. But is it bad? I don't know. Let's put a pin in that. Maybe we need a rupture to help us think about our context and experiences from new perspective. Now, I'm not going to lie, the rupture is not easy. It is hard. It is also violent at times. But the rupture could also be a reckoning moment. So what are we supposed to do? Keep old wineskins and old wine in old wineskins and new wine in new wineskins, never let them mix. Just stay in, just like the way we stay in our silos, like the way we have come to be. We interact with our world through our own silos, within our own communities, just to keep the peace. Is that kind of what Jesus is saying here? Catherine Wallace describes parables as a metaphor that is acted out. A parable is a metaphor turned into a story in order to convey an insight that cannot be conveyed with the same precision and nuance in non-metaphorical language. Jesus does this a lot. He teaches in parables, and often those scholars who do empire work wonder why Jesus is teaching in parables, and they draw on the work of James C. Scott, who talks about how people who are oppressed have a tendency to talk in code with one another, and the parables serve as codes that they're talking to each other under the gaze of the empire. It seems to me that Jesus is not warning us against the mixing of the old and new, but rather speaking to the inevitability of these mixings that lead to change. Thus, rather than running away from change, how do we confront these changes in our own context that could sometimes lead to our own rupturing and the bursting of? The next slide, sir. I would like to introduce the work of Katlego Mokoena, who is a South African biblical scholar. He applies this parable to the issue of police brutality in South Africa and provides for a more theological interpretation of this text. Mokoena starts with his own context. Remember what I said, start with the personal. He starts with his own context and particularly talks about the COVID-19 lockdown and the economy of South Africa. He says, like many countries, South Africa included, was left in this dilemma of whether to save people's lives or save their livelihood. In addition to this, the death of George Floyd in the US became a visceral moment for the world as we human beings were confronted with the brutality and the horrific violence of racism that continues to this day. People from South Africa also joined in this worldwide protest and condemning the death of George Floyd, while also reflecting and recognizing the condemning and the death of their own people at the hands of police brutality that was happening. At this point, I'd also introduced the Indian context where we witness a similar brutality on migrant workers. We all watched with horror and helplessness of how police were beating up migrant workers and using excessive force and dehumanizing methods during the COVID-19 lockdown. Can we switch the slide? I think we can agree that the pandemic, as a reflection of ourselves, left us horrified at the lens of our depravity and cruelty towards one another. Studies of police work during the pandemic in many countries have revealed that police officers had or enforced unpopular restrictions, which affected their already apprehensive relationship with the public. Mokoena, in his article, recounts the death of a 16-year-old boy, Nathaniel Julius, that took place during the fierce confrontations between police and the residents of El Dorado Park in South Africa. He also points out that around him the context and tactics of violence and humiliation was especially deployed towards the poor. Next slide. South Africa, similar to other contexts, and you'll see here on the screen, you will see, the top left is a scene what happened in South Africa. The on the side of your screen, that image is from India, and how when migrants were walking home because the trains and buses and everything had stopped, and the only way for them to get to their houses was they had to just walk miles and miles with no food, no water. In many cases, the police would just stop these group of migrants and hose them down with disinfectants in very, very dehumanizing way. And it was shocking because nobody knew how to help, and people had just also come to be desensitized to these images. South Africa, similar to other contexts, also noted a lack of police visibility in the suburban areas. We often found police in poorer communities, and this demonstrated a lack of concern, unprofessionalism, and ineptitude. This led to a lack of trust, as well as a history of police brutality and human rights violation due to the militarized tactics. Mokena argues that the police brutality experienced in South Africa during the pandemic was nothing but new wine in old wineskins. He argues that the pre-1994 police force to the post-1994 police force had remained the same. The police brutality used during apartheid had resurfaced during the pandemic. Old wine in new wineskins, causing a rupture, a bursting of violence. Next slide. The issue, as I'm sure we all recognize, is that while the police may have changed, the culture encasing the policy of policing was still the same. In other words, it was not just about finding new wineskins that could accommodate the new. It was about learning how to prepare these new wineskins and transform these encasings to contain the new wine, while also allowing the new wine to breathe, expand, and live into their vitality. So Mokena does something very interesting. When he contextualizes this parable and calls for a transformation and suggests for new wineskins, he draws on the old to accommodate the new. Slide 10. Ubuntu is a Zulu word which has parallels in many other African languages. It has been defined in a variety of ways in academic discourses as humanness and African worldview. Ubuntu is humanness. Being human entails being respectful, polite, caring, and peace-loving, among other positive attributes. Another African scholar, Bolden, defines Ubuntu as a social philosophy based on principles of care and community, harmony, hospitality, respect, and responsiveness. Ubuntu also focuses on the inclusivity of everyone within a community. It is the basis of traditional African communal cultural life. Justice-loving communities exhibit the Ubuntu ideal, often expressed in the proverb, as you see on your screen, a person is a person through other people. A person is a person through other people. Drawing on Ubuntu philosophy, Mokena stresses community relationships, demilitarization, and human rights training. Police trainees are given a variety of modules to ensure they're educated in respecting human rights. They are taught not to compromise human rights and police principles, and to observe community policing. Healing the wounds caused by police brutality does not happen overnight. It is a process that requires all stakeholders to participate in. The Ubuntu culture of policing, healing wounds, and restoration of human dignity is thus a holistic approach to combat police brutality. Some South African scholars have critiqued Ubuntu as vague or utopian. But as Mokena points out, Ubuntu emphasizes that human life is more precious, and those entrusted to protect and serve should be held accountable for their actions. And we must continue to find approaches that facilitate and restore harmony and justice. The next slide. Okay, what does all this have to do with Mark? Let's go back to the parable. As readers, we tend to pay attention to the process of wanting to keep the wineskins from bursting. We are constantly trying to find ways to either maintain the old wineskins or to find new wineskins. But in the process, we have overlooked a very important aspect of this parable. And that is the old wine and the new wine are interconnected by their essence. Similarly, old garment and new garment also have their essence, their cloth that is in common. And as much as we want to protect the new wine, one day or the other, let's face it, the new wine is going to grow old. Nothing will stay new. Sooner or later, it will grow old. And similar to the new wineskins, similarly, the new wineskins will also grow old, will stretch and become brittle. So instead of focusing on how to maintain the old and the new in their silos, what if we begin to focus on how these two are interconnected? What if we ask questions of possibilities that this parable does not quite address? Are there ways in which the old and new can coexist? Mokena's reading of the parable is helpful because even though he draws on the metaphor of new policing, that change comes from his knowledge. It is contextual and it's old philosophy. The newness is that he draws on his ancestral and contextual knowledge and connects it to the contemporary context of police trainings. The Ubuntu philosophy becomes that connective tissue that reveals the human dignity of the people to the police and vice versa. So now, the next slide. I'm almost done. And this is where the fun part happens. Change, as Mokena shows us, is contextual. What works for one context will not work for the other. Both Jesus and Paul make the exact same point. Jesus' parables illustrate the importance of his context. This is not a rhetorical question. What is your context telling you about how you need to change? And pushing this further, how are your own stories, traditions, rituals, informing you to step in that new direction? This is where y'all come in. I did the hard work. I broke it down. Yes. What is your own context telling you about how you need to change or what you need to change? And pushing this further, how are your own stories informing you to step in new directions?
Well, I guess the stories for me of churches and women's groups building institutions that change society kind of have informed our congregation in, establishing a recovery cafe or establishing a food bank out in the back porch. It's the stories of women who, got the right to vote. Or women who said, wait a minute, we're killing all these birds to have feathers in our hats. So I think historically I see stories that inform. And then I think with the church, back in whatever year it was, 2002, whatever, where we realized we don't really have enough money to pay somebody full time. and the elderly woman who's 85 says, God is not finished with this church yet.
Yes.
And so the younger woman says, okay, I'm going to rely on your faith. I'll keep showing up and see what happens. So, yeah.
That is such a great example of the old and the new coming together and finding ways to work with one another versus just like, let's just dump everything that's old and let's go after this new technology, right? But technology is important, don't get me wrong. But how are we using that technology to reach and make inroads, right? Others, yes.
So the thing that came to my mind when you asked what needs to change, the thing that popped into my head was, the budget is out of balance. It's in deficit. We need to find new ways to raise money to fund our ministry justly. And the operative story is the way we raise money is we ask people to make pledges. And that old story isn't working. People know we need to be creative, either change what we're doing or change how much money we have, or a combination of the two, so that there's enough money to do our ministry justly. And when it comes to being creative about other ways to raise money, there is huge resistance.
Yes.
Because the story says the way we raise money is we ask people to make pledges.
Yes, yes. The story sometimes needs to be deconstructed. And how are we deconstructing it in our context? I do have a parable for you, which often gets misinterpreted. The parable of the talents. There's a different way to read that. There's a different way to read that. And if we have time, I will blow your mind. I'm just saying. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. My name is Esther,
Hi, Esther.
and hello, and I'm we're the new church who just joined from the Samoan church.
Mhm.
We have quite a lot of youth and also elderly, well, not elderly, older people. So what we try to do is to teach them for elders to be open mind to what we try to install, and for the youth to be respectful. So that's how that's what we teach them, is to be open mind and to accept or try to learn, and for the youth to be respectful. Respectful is come a long way. We always teach our children to be respectful of their elders, their parents, or whoever they're with. Thank you.
Mhm. Yes, thank you so much. And I'm sure you have in your own context as well, stories that are unique to your Samoan tradition that gets passed down from generation to generation. That just like Ubuntu, right? Ubuntu helps Mokena think about police brutality in a different way, right? So what are those stories? Others who want to jump in? Oh, somebody here? Oh, there, okay.
Well, I'm actually glad I belong to two denominations that don't shun you when you say things like I'm going to say. So I'll start with my story first, which has made me kind of sensitive and aware to the Christian situation. And reading of Acts and Paul has led me to understand that the very church we are so much a part of is an act of colonialism. And Christianity itself is. So how do we reread scripture and retell the story without dismantling our entire organization, or do we want to? Do we need to keep it?
Anybody has responses? Yes, Jim.
this might follow that okay. What's coming up for me is that I see a need, and so I'm trying to construct my life in a way so that I can do something about it. And the story that keeps coming up is that I have to move toward power to meet the need. And the more that I get pulled toward power, the further away from the need I get. And so there has to be a way to decolonize that.
Sure, one that came up today, Steve, he, him. Our structure across our denomination has worked on the binary of gender. We have men's ministries, women's ministries, and even during this regional gathering, we have this tension over operating still under old binaries and not finding new ways to rethink our gatherings and the way we think about gender. And something's going to have to give somewhere where we break through and begin to create new spaces and maybe dismantle old spaces.
Right. I think the concept of hybridity here is very helpful. Post-colonial theory talks about hybridity, where, you know, when those binaries are deconstructed, what tends to happen is you don't completely dismantle the old and the new. The old and the new essences seep into one another and they become hybrid, right? And people are really scared of hybridity because, oh, hybridity, the third space, I don't like the third gender. Where do you really fit in? The point is you're not supposed to, because you do get impacted in ways and become, you know, you find ways where that essence seeps into one another and you become hybrid. So within the new wine and new wineskins, I think one of the questions I had was, what if the new wine, you know, you pour, you know, you pour new wine into a wineskin, which already has a little bit of the old wine, right? And then what happens? You know, does it still burst? You know, the parable doesn't tell you, but there's a way in which you can start imagining how the new and the old can mix. I mean, I do not quote me on this, and maybe some of y'all are wine connoisseurs here, but I read somewhere that if you take really good old wine and mix it with really good new wine, you really get good wine. So, you know, yeah, it's true. Okay.
Good plan.
So,
Yeah.
you know, so is it really a bursting? Well, maybe a bursting of a different kind of joy, maybe. But yes, sir.
My name's Walter. My context is that I grew up in a military family in the suburbs and so forth. And yet somehow this Jesus fellow got a hold of me in my teenage years. And I found that I had to stand against the war in Vietnam, which when your father is a career Air Force officer does not earn you a lot of good points. So I know about this effect of sudden change, seemingly for good on one side and seemingly sheer disruption and insult on the other clashing. But when I see these stories, these code switching parables, I see that the production of cloth, gathering the fibers, spinning them, making them into a fabric, and then putting them on a loom and making wine. These are actions of many hands, of a community, and it takes time. And I think what we have to do is overcome the American lust for instant gratification and explain it that as we are Ubuntu, all of one as a people, we have to give the process time, and we each have to be willing to do our part, whether it's gathering the grapes or coloring the dye, setting the dyes for those conditions. But we're still going to have rips, no matter what. and I hope not too much spilled wine.
Yes. Though it depends, how it's, yeah. On for whom the wine is filling.
Just a quick aside, brewmasters are using whiskey barrels and wine barrels to age their beer or to hold their beer
Oh, they changed their casing completely, huh?
to change the taste. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what you're all getting at is this idea of patience and openness, right? It's the way in which I think Esther, right? You said, how the old and the new are just interacting with one another with openness and grace, and be willing to change for one another, because it is about, you're a person through another person, right? And that kind of philosophy is really, really helpful. Others who want to jump in, what's coming up for you as we talk about this change? I'm so glad, we're not saying, oh, a website. Well, a website is good, but if people are showing up to your congregation and no one's welcoming them, it's not going to get you anywhere.
Hi,
Yes.
Latanya, she, her, and I just wanted to address Godfrey and I think our misunderstanding of power, which is a neutral term. It just means the ability to get, I'll say in church, stuff done.
Yes.
That's all it means. And so it's how we get those things done. Are we collaborative? Are we authoritarian? Do we bring other people to the table, as we like to say, amongst the disciples? So I don't want people to be afraid of power or of that term, because it can assume, and this is not what I heard you say, Godfrey, but it can assume that power is good and oppressive all the time. And so not having power is to be oppressed, when really we all have power. We all have the ability to get things done. And so the question's always, how will we go about that important work? And thank you for opening up scripture in new ways. This always excites me. And so thank you.
It's the Bible nerd in me, I'm telling you. Others who want to jump in. Oh, yes. That's such a good point, Reverend. Thank you for saying that. We all have power. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Max, he, him, and I grew up in churches that were maybe a little stuffy, and when I first started going to a disciple church, I had my little daughter with me, and everybody said, yeah, bring her in. She can make noise. She can, participate. And I think for me, part of it is that the structure of the formality of church. Does it need to be as formal as we've made it sometimes? Can we wear t-shirts? Can we wear shorts? What does that look like, and how does that contribute to an open environment where everybody can be themselves? That's kind of what started to come up for me.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. How do we decolonize that word church? Because for many of us, the word church, anybody else who wants to speak up? For many of us, the word church is a very colonial term, and it comes with certain traumas and histories, right? Like, I think about going to church in India, and we went to English church. So I'm one of those people, if you ask me to pray in my language, I don't know how to pray in my language, because my parents really wanted us to study in English, right? And so, that was very important. And we had to be dressed in a particular way. And children were not really welcome, right? Parents with really small children had to sit at the back of the pew so that if they made a lot of noise, they could, just like my son is taking my little fellow out, go out, so it was that kind of thing. So it brings up a lot of trauma. And then you come to this country and, you go, wait, children are welcome here? That's not what the missionaries told us. Why hasn't that change happened yet? So brings up a lot. Yes. Thank you for saying that.
Hi, Cindy Knox, she, her. One of the things that occurs for me is that the old wineskin, the old fabric, is something that has become rigid. It doesn't mean it has to stay rigid. And I think there are ways sometimes to kind of work the leather or work the fabric to loosen it up a little bit so that it's able to move in new ways. But you can't just slap something dynamic on something static. You have to be able to loosen that up. And especially the illustration with the fabric, when you've got a garment that's torn, you're talking about something that's already injured. And so now it's rigid and it's injured. And the first thing you're going to do is you're going to put something on it that you say, this is going to fix it. But because it's dynamic, it's going to shrink and it's going to pull and it's going to aggravate that injury that's already there. So I don't think it's just a question of new versus old. It's about rigidity and dynamicism that you have to be able to get those to work together somehow. You can't just take something that is moored and then hook it up to a barge that's going by. Something's going to tear. So you have to have some flexibility on the one side, and maybe on the other side, eventually anything dynamic has a tendency to slow down. I know I have.
Yeah. Oh, that's so important. That's so important for you to say that, because yes, it's not about just pouring new wine into old wineskins. Are there ways in which we can first prepare the old wineskins to make them more flexible and room to grow? Yeah. And not screw the lid on it. Yeah, there you go. There you go. Yes, this is so much. This is bringing up for me something that started to happen in my church in the last year or so. I go to a church, Lafayette United Methodist Church in Lafayette. And over the last year, this has been so interesting. We've had a couple of families, more than 3-4 families who have started attending our church who are South Asians, right? So Indians, Bangladeshi, from Pakistan. And many of them who are coming in, now, of course, because again, this is an insider thing, right? So I'm Indian and I saw these families coming in. I grew up Christian. I kind of knew they were not Christian, right? So I reached out. We were talking because we see 2 Indian people and a whole bunch of white folks where we gravitate towards one another, right? So we're having a conversation, and it turned out that one of them actually grew up in my town, Bangalore, in India, and knew kind of all the same hubs, went to similar schools, colleges, and so I said, how come you found this place?
The meeting's being recorded.
And she said, I love singing in the choir. Right. That's what she said. I love singing in the choir. And I'm not Christian. I'm Hindu. My husband is actually a practicing Hindu as well. And so, they both started talking about how church in this country was about evoking a memory that was very dear to her. So she was coming to church. She's coming to church. She sings in the choir. So does a couple of other families. They just come to sing in the choir. They could care less about theology, doctrine, what have you. They're coming, it's about community. It's about a memory that is very dear to them. So here you have a situation where people are coming because they're hungering for community. The US Surgeon General, I think it was a couple of years ago, talked about the epidemic of loneliness. People are lonely, right? For many of us over here, as we were saying, me included, we talk about how church is very colonial and has some trauma with it. And yet you have a group of people for whom church and singing in the choir has some really happy memories associated with it. So how do you then begin to minister to them, right? One thing that started happening in our church is we started talking about, you have folks coming in who are who follow different religions and rituals. So we should have like a Diwali celebration. And rest of the church was like, what? And he was like, you know, it's this a Hindu festival where you burn a lot of firecrackers and you eat a lot of good foods. And so we had a Diwali celebration. And of course, the Indian people were really, myself included, really enthusiastic about, sharing our food. And it was all about building community over food and rituals and traditions that a lot of other folk didn't know existed. So how are your communities changing and how are people finding these spaces, right? Yeah, so that's what came up for me. Can we get back to the slide? I have time, right? I have time. 10 or 15 minutes. Okay. I have time, right? I have time. Okay. Yes, this one, I wanted to bring this to your attention. This is the Sikh temple in India. It's called the Golden Temple. And they have the Sikh community, if you've ever been to a Sikh community, they have what is called as langars. Langars are community kitchen. And the Golden Temple in India is supposed to have the world's largest, I don't like this description, but I will say it anyway. They call it the world's largest soup kitchen. That is not right. It's not a soup kitchen, right? But basically, anyone can go attend these langars. They have food, they prepare food, and you can go and eat to your heart's content. No questions asked. Nobody cares where you come from. What's your caste? What's your religion? Nobody cares. And it's a big deal in an Indian context where people are not checking your caste card at the door. They come in, you can eat, and then if you feel called, you can go and work in the kitchen and make food for other people to eat, right? And so these langars are a big thing because this is about feeding people, right? How are you building community? What are your stories? What are those traditions? What are you drawing? They're drawing on the old, feeding the new, right? So this is a thing I wanted to bring to you. And I think like the churches in India can learn a lot from, just religious traditions around them. Why do we hesitate to draw on other religious traditions? That's all knowledge. That's contextual knowledge, right? That's ancestral knowledge. How do we draw on that within our own churches?
Then the one who had received the 1 talent came forward and said, Master, I knew you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground here. Here you have what is yours. The master replied, You wicked and lazy slave. You knew, did you, that I reap where I do not sow and gather where I do not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, Charles Schwab or something. And on my return, I would have received with what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But even from those who have nothing, even from what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.
Thank you, Walter. That was a great way you read that text. What a joyful text, isn't it, friends? Oh my God, come on. We have so much hope in a passage like this. I am kidding. So, tell me what you see in the text. Yes, Jeffrey, right? Yeah.
I see it totally misplaced by Matthew into his final judgment text because it had nothing to do with the final judgment. It has to do with a corrupt economic system.
Okay, good. Corrupt economic system, good. Misplaced judgment. What else do you see in the text? When you read the text, how do you feel? How do you feel? Inadequate. What else? Meritocracy. Okay. What else? Oh, yes, Sharon.
What I have always seen in this reading, and I'm well aware there's variations to choose among, but is that there's a total lack of caring. And I mean, there's the one right way to do it, by golly, and that's how we're going to do it. And we don't care who we hurt along the way. I have one very brief illustration from way years ago, years and years ago. I was working in a small office supply / stationery store. And it was at the time when home printers were just coming in and everybody had their own home printer. And we all switched from typewriter ribbons to, it tells you how old this is, typewriter ribbons to ink cartridges. But I spent half of my days for months at that time with older people. You can tell, again, it was a long time ago, so those old people looked ancient to me then, not from where I'm sitting today. But they would actually break into tears because no arrangement had been made to make a smooth transition. It was a flat out either or. And for them to move anywhere, they would have to buy printers and learn how to use them because that was all that was being offered anymore. They could not find any longer ribbons to fit their typewriters, and they'd use their typewriters for 20, 30, 40 years. And working in the store, we used to try to communicate with the producers and the manufacturers and all of this, and they didn't care. And I tend to hear that in this story.
About new wine and oh.
I hear Herbert Spencer and social Darwinism just loud and clear in that reading.
Okay, good, yes.
That's kind of what I'm hearing here too. At least when I was younger, the church I grew up in is that, especially with the word talent being misapplied, that this was what God had given us. And, maybe even in a caste way, though this, in the United States, we don't have it as strongly typed. But possibly the worst reading I've ever heard of this was a second place sermon in a contest at the seminary that I attended, Chicago Theological Seminary, though many years before I was there, where it began. The scripture tells us that there are 5 talent men, 2 talent men, and 1 talent man. Enter therefore eugenics.
Ooh, wow. And that got second place?
That one's,
Yeah.
of course, it was a eugenics contest, a eugenics sermon contest, but still, that was awful.
Yeah. Yeah, Monica.
Oh, I just see that the wise, the informed person who is careful and cautious gets screwed.
Yes, of course, right? How has this parable traditionally, apart from the eugenics piece, because that was new, I have never heard that, but how has this parable traditionally been interpreted? Old wine. What's the old wine, right? Yes.
You better get out there and do something with your stuff. And you better be extroverted. And you better not hide, and you better not act scared, or you're going to go to hell.
Yep, very good. Yes.
And you better not acknowledge that your master is actually a man who abuses the poor, reaps where he does not sow. You better not say that. And that's the truth, though.
Yes. Many of you have heard this sermon on, what is it, Stewardship Sunday? Yeah. Ah, man, what do we do? Traditional readings of this text often read the man as God. You've heard that too, right? That's a problem when we start reading God into this text, right? Especially when Jesus doesn't really say that it's God. It's a man with a what vineyard field? What does he have? He is rich. He has a property, all right? So he gives 5 talents to one, 2 talents to the other, and 1 talent to the other, according to their ability. Does that strike anyone as odd? What does that mean? Was there a contest? Was it eugenics? Right? What does that mean? The text doesn't tell us. Now, he's going to go away, and the one with 5 talents, what does he do? He goes and makes 5 more, right? The other with 2 makes 2 more, and then of course we know what happens with the third with the third slave. So let's keep that aside. The first 2 with the 5 and the 2 talents, right? What do they end up doing? They double the money and they get rewarded for it. The text tells you they get rewarded, correct? How do they get rewarded? Bigger responsibility. Did any of them? Yes.
They're still slaves.
You Walter, give me a high five. Exactly, y'all. They didn't get freed. They just got more stuff to do. Did that strike anyone as odd? Yes.
Hillary. And yet this reads as a sales point for the kingdom of heaven.
Yes, if you go with the old wine, right? The old wine. Not always does the old wine taste good. Yeah, you're right, because that's how usually it's been read, right? Here you are, you need to make more in order to get more, give more to the church. What happens to the third person who gets only 1 talent? Does he have anything to give? No, really. We expect him to give that 1 talent, to the master, find ways to invest in it. And yet, what does this man do? How? Oh, sorry. Apologies.
So he refuses to participate in the economic system by investing that talent at Schwab. He says, no, I'm taking this talent and I'm burying it in the ground, and he's going to come back and demand that I prove that I'm good at this stuff, but F him.
Okay. Oh, I had that. What does that make him? Marxist, rebellious, what else? Amazing? Lazy? Yes. Lazy is something that we've heard all the time. Yeah. From whose? Huh? Oh, sorry.
You're asking what does it make him? It depends from whose perspective. He could be honorable because he's not taking what's not his and only giving back to someone what is theirs, and therefore not. So he could be doing the honorable thing, not the rebellious or even bad thing by cultural norms.
Exactly right. He could be doing the honorable thing, not really the rebellious thing. Anybody thought Oh, go ahead.
I just caught the damned if you do and damned if you don't part of it.
Yes, there's no winning. There is no winning. Oh, no.
Yes. Damned if you do and damned if you don't, and damned if I'm going to make money for this guy. It's a counter revolutionary activity.
Okay, what else could you say? He's a Marxist. What did we say? He's a rebel. Anybody thought whistleblower? What does he say about the master? What does he say about the master? Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. What is he saying about his master?
You're a son of a bitch.
Okay. And
I was just saying he's abusive.
he's abusive. His true nature was exposed by the third slave. Are you? Oh, yes, sir.
I got life sucks and then you die.
Yeah.
I say that because I see two categories. There's one who obviously made an investment, but then the guy with the one talent, he did what he got because it said it gave talents according to his skills,
Yeah.
to his talent. So hey, if that guy, you know, he's got 5 talents, give him 5 talents. If there's a guy who got 2 skills, 2 abilities, to whatever, give him 2. And he knew the one only had 1 talent, well, hey, give him 1. So the other 2 did their job and they got the same award, you know, enter into the joy of the kingdom of your Lord. So this guy, the one guy, he did what he was supposed to do, although he didn't make a profit for him, but he didn't get a reward. So the other 2 are the same category because like on a Super Bowl team, the quarterback gets a Super Bowl ring. If you're a second stringer, you still get a Super Bowl ring. But this guy, although he didn't, you know, he was part of the Super Bowl team, but he didn't get a ring. So that's why I say, oh, well, life sucks. You know, too bad. You know, that's just the way life is. You know, you get what you
But if you
get.
take that point and push it further, there's going to be a time when the other 2 slaves will find themselves just like the third. It's the system that the third slave is exposing, is he not? That the system is unfair. The system does not provide or pay monies equitably. Right? Like
Yeah.
you could push that even further. And you can, you know, because traditionally we have always read the third slave as lazy, as the one who has just 1 talent. But if you think about it, oh, he's pretty talented.
Yeah, because using what our scripture reader, he joked around, he said Charles Schwab. I mean, if you're going to beg with someone, you at least you don't want nobody who's going to give you losses.
Right.
And-
But push it even further, I would say. I'm coming to you, Sharon. Just push it even further to talk about how the system rewards people with, rewards people with money, right? If you don't have enough money, where am I supposed to bring the investment from? Right? So what does he do? How does this man, and he exposes, how has this man made his money? How has he made his money? He has sowed, what does it say? The text tells you. He has reaped where he did not sow. Right? He has gathered where without scattering any seed. He has made this money by leasing it out, slave labor, leasing his stuff out to these people, many of whom are probably slaves on their own land. Let that sink in. If you are a slave on your own land and you're making money for your master, would I be a little pissed off? I hope so. So what does he do? He takes out the money from the circulation, digs a hole, and puts it in. And when the master comes in, what does he do? He blows the whistle on the system. New wine or old wine? Would you read that? Oh, that was totally great. Oh, no.
The one thing we haven't actually said totally out loud yet is that the master verifies, you know who I am and what you described. That's who I am. You know that. I know that. And I'm not remotely ashamed of it. So, because his view of the system, his place in the system has made him the good guy in his own eyes because he's acting within the system.
And the system benefits him. This goes back to what Reverend Latanya was saying. Who has power? In the story, everyone has power. But what do they do with that power? Even the one who is the most vulnerable uses his power to show up the system, right? By non-cooperation and violence, right? Yeah.
So this answers my first question. Well, my first question is, what do I do when I feel like I have to cooperate with the system in order to have resources to meet needs? And I love the notion that outer darkness is liberation.
Because what is this text foreshadowing? Who ends up being thrown out to darkness with the weeping and gnashing of teeth? Who else? Third slave, but what is it foreshadowing? What's it foreshadowing? Who is it foreshadowing? Who ends up? Yeah, go ahead.
Just thinking about the judgments in this and relating them to current judgments, how the entitled consider people on welfare, people of, minorities, the poor. And the other is that Walter Rauschenbusch actually has a book that proclaims that you can't actually be a Christian if you own stock, because you're not working.
Yes, Jeffrey?
So the next parable in Matthew 25 is the parable of the sheep and the goats.
Uh-huh.
And the goats get thrown out of the kingdom because they have not helped the least of these.
Right. Right. But like, go back to the thing. What is it foreshadowing? Who ends up in the system crucified?
Jesus.
God, it's the JC. It's JC. Whenever in doubt in a New Testament class, I tell this to my students all the time. Whenever in doubt, say Jesus. It's usually the right answer.
It sure sounds like a squirrel, but I think you're talking about Jesus.
This is Jesus, right? Because what happens to Jesus when he shows up the system, when he calls out the Roman Empire? Yeah, right? So we have traditionally read the story as the third slave, as the lazy one, as the one with the least talent, but he is actually the courageous one, couldn't he? Yes. Oh, sorry. Welcome.
Be careful, you're confusing the talent that you can sing beautifully or preach or draw with the talent which they're referring to, which is basically 15 to 18 years of wages for a common laborer with a giant silver bar.
Yeah. No. I'm not talking about singing. That's another interpretation that I deeply, really disagree with, because that is not what the text is not saying they were singing. That's not what the text is saying. The text is talking about money. This is a parable about economics. This is a parable about capitalism, right? This is a parable that tells you we have to talk in code because our lives are in danger, right? This is not new wine. It's old wine. Because who is Jesus talking to? He's talking to people who have been oppressed in the system. So when he talks in code, they know exactly what he's saying. Here's the problem. 2,000 years later, we've totally messed this up. Right? And we're making this about stewardship. It's not about stewardship. It's about power. and how even the least of us can find ways to resist power in small ways. Because what this man does is very, very small. He digs a hole, people, and puts the coin in the ground. But he resists the system. How do you do that? At the rest of this conference, and as you go about your way.